It's time for another Triple M Footy News Update with Tom Browne. My name's Rudy. I've got Tommy here in the studio. We're going through a massive laundry list of news today, Tommy. Lots of stuff happening at Carlton, which we want to discuss. We've got a bit of a fact check coming up. You want to discuss the concussion test, some injuries, of course, and contract stock watch. My name's Rudy. Tommy, how you going?
Good morning, Rudy. Lots to discuss this morning, but I do want to start with the Blues. On one hand, they lost to the Western Bulldogs, who are a potential premiership contender or are a premiership contender, so I wouldn't be too worried. But the concern clearly for Carlton this morning is they're 3 and 5. They've got Melbourne, Hawthorn, Sydney and West Coast coming up. It looks unlikely at this stage they're going to make the finals. Kane Little, when they sacked Brendan Bolton, put their win-loss record on record and also said that the expectation, I think, at the start of this year was to make the final. So Carlton, judged against their own expectations, aren't tracking according to plan, and they're going to be an interesting discussion point this week. One of them is this notion of kamikaze football. Their forwards fired yesterday, in particular Betts and McKay. Wiedering fired, but this much talked about midfield, in particular Cripps and Walsh. You can't blame Sam Walsh, but the midfield gets beaten week in, week out. Williams, Fogarty and Cripps, they're not endurance-based types. I wonder again whether Williams is injured, potentially without Achilles injury, but he's not an endurance type of guy, and that's what the concern is. Carlton now already looking at past guys like Setterfield and Dow, so there's issues at Carlton.
Yeah, well, you mentioned that they lost with firing, some firing forwards. So Harry Mackay leading the Coleman kicked 4 goals yesterday. Eddie Betts rolled back the clock with his 5. You mentioned Wiedering and Jones, both dominant. 25 points up, 25-minute mark of the third quarter.
27 points at one stage. Mackay kicked their 4th or 5th goal, and they're looking headed towards a win.
They go on to lose by 16. It's not a great look. I think they shipped the last 7 goals of the game in a row, and it's a tough look for Carlton at the moment. And do you feel that there's pressure increasing on David Teague?
Well, I think there is judged against Carlton's own expectations. Mark Laguduche was quite clear on radio last week. Laguduche, the current president, sort of acted surprised there was pressure on David Teague. But if finals are the expectation and win-loss is the expectation, and they've done all this work on their list, it's apparently ready to make the finals, it becomes a question of patience and how much they've got.
Indeed. Let's move on to Collingwood. I've said it before and I'll say it again. We can't really go a podcast without discussing them. You just wanted to fact check some stuff.
No, this is the fact check section that contains some Collingwood points.
Right, okay. So we're not specifically talking Collingwood. We're fact checking, but there's a bit of Collingwood in here, Tommy.
Correct. Eddie Maguire suggested yesterday that Port Adelaide received $7 million more than Collingwood from the AFL. This is in connection with the discussion on the prison bar jumpers, which really hit peak argument during the weekend,
didn't it?
That was an old-fashioned slanging match.
Indeed. How was the vision of Port sticking the Guernseys on to sing the song on Saturday night? What did you make of that before we carry on?
It was like a little ambush, wasn't it? It was more than a skirmish. It was like an ambush.
Yeah, I guess I don't mind. It's for their fans, really, isn't it?
Well, that's what they say.
Yeah,
it's an interesting issue.
I think that's fair.
The AFL didn't have a problem with it. Anyway, last year I think Port Adelaide received around $11.9 million in 2020. From the AFL, Collingwood received around 12.3. So I know historically Port have received more money, but at least last year, Collingwood, in fact, received more money from the AFL. In regards to Eddie's point on the web, on selling these jumpers, Eddie's concerned that a lot of the people in the crowd on Saturday night were wearing these prison bar jumpers, and there's an agreement apparently, which I haven't seen, the 2019 agreement, no one will give it to me, where Port agreed not to sell these jumpers, but I've clarified that with Port overnight. They say they were allowed to, with AFL permission, sell the prison bar contemporary, that's those new ones, 150th jumpers last year. They're all sold out as per the production run, and that's what a lot of people in the crowd have. And the jumpers on their website at the moment are the old school Port Adelaide traditional ones, like the old school V-neck black and white jumpers. Again, Port say they're entitled to sell their historic Port Adelaide jumper. So Port are adamant they're not in breach of any regulations there relating to selling those jumpers. I think Collingwood and Eddie have a different view. The other fact check I'd like to do from the weekend was Ned Guy. Collingwood came out with a strongly worded statement on Saturday night defending Ned Guy's attendance, the current list boss, who's the outgoing list boss, at representative matches over recent years. Ned's the list boss. He's not the recruiting boss. So as the list boss, they've got to be across all the recruiting. So technically, Derek Hine attends a lot of those games. But Ned, for example, this year, I think even just this year, has been to games all over the country. So Matt Rendell's points regarding not attending matches, I think, were patently wrong, and Collingwood came out and explained that on the weekend. But I think came out and explained that on Saturday night. But I think Ned's been to games in Sydney this year, the Gold Coast, Perth, Adelaide. So it's just not right. And obviously the list manager, who's effectively like the boss of the list, has to go to underage games, state league games, and the AFL games. So there's always a balance.
Concussion tests are under the spotlight, Tommy.
Got some news on this morning.
Yep, go on.
Now, Murphy from Collingwood.
Nathan Murphy,
was subbed out with concussion in the third quarter. Subsequently, Collingwood say he passed a concussion test after the game. Roughhead suffered a serious head knock in the fourth quarter, didn't partake further in the game. Collingwood again say that he cleared a concussion test post-game. Now, I've spoken to some AFL contacts this morning and got the wording on where this all sits. It does say in connection with this substantive change where a player is withheld from a game with a presumptive diagnosis on concussion, but on subsequent assessment, the club doctor and or specialist supports a change in that diagnosis. The subsequent assessment must be discussed and can only be approved by the AFL Chief Medical Officer. That's a wordy way of saying that if Murphy was diagnosed with presumptive concussion, but afterwards they determine that he hasn't got concussion, if you go to Peter Harcourt, who's the AFL Chief Medical Officer this week, you can discuss whether he can play within the 12 days. As for Ruffy, again, we don't know if there was an official diagnosis of concussion, but again, Collingwood can go and talk about that presumptive diagnosis with the AFL Chief Medical Officer. So they'll be discussing that today. I did notice on Friday night, Rudy, that a number of players suffered some pretty big head knocks and kept playing. Now, this is not to cast aspersions on the Geelong and Richmond medical staff, who are entirely and very professional, but Radaglia on the wing in front of where I was doing the boundary riding for Triple M suffered a massive head knock and kept playing. And Selwood obviously laid the hip and shoulder, which he was cleared for at the MRO on Mansell, who I remember his name from Nigel Mansell, who most of our older audience will relate to and some of the younger audience won't. His nickname was Lion. He's a British Formula 1 driver.
I remember playing Nigel Mansell's Formula 1 on my Super Nintendo when
Correct.
I was a kid.
Anyway, back on topic, Mansell kept playing as well after suffering a pretty heavy head knock. So I think there'll be some discussion around those protocols and some of the diagnosis around that this week. Having said that, the doctors are very conservative and very professional.
Just to go back briefly to the Collingwood ones there, this is a big test, isn't it, really? It's not quite Nick Riewoldt suggesting he'd take him to the Supreme Court level, but it is...
It's a test because under the rules, if you suffer a concussion, you've got to sit out 12 days. If you get subbed off with an injury, you can come back within 12 days, providing you go and talk to the AFL about it. So a lot of people think, concussion, 12 days, you've got to miss 12 days. What Collingwood's trying to do is go under this presumptive diagnosis route, which I don't think anyone's gone down yet. So we're going to learn more about that in the next couple of days.
Yeah, it's a big test for the for those rules. Speaking of injuries, you've got a few to run through, Tom?
Yeah, some pretty serious injuries or interesting stories to go through this morning. Now, Stringer, been on fire for the Bombers, hamstring injury. For the Dogs, Jamari Ugle-Hagan suffered a concussion in the VFL. The Dogs have got a bye anyway, but he'll obviously miss at least 12 days. Edwards, that ankle that had syndesmosis written all over it from Friday night. I think that there's every chance that could be 8, 10, 12 weeks. Ooh. He'll see specialists today, so just emphasise that's just a guide. I don't know for a fact yet, just in case Jack Riewoldt or anyone wants to attack me on a Richmond injury diagnosis. I get on well with Jack these days. I guess there'll be some more questions whether Zach Williams is fully fit this week. I mentioned that he has some Achilles soreness. Sometimes he only had 9 touches yesterday and played 79% of game time. So I think that'll be a discussion point this week.
Yes, indeed, as injuries always are. That Edwards one is a tough one, isn't it? For a team that Richmond have been so good with injuries, really, over the...
Yeah, they've had a good run.
They've had a decent run. I mean, guys coming back at the right time and stuff, but that Edwards one, that's tough. One of my favourite players to watch, Shedder, so hopefully it's not that bad for him. You wanted to do some contract stock watch, Tommy. Before we get fully into it, we had some contract news on Triple M yesterday on the Sunday Rub.
So, Josh, where does it sit with you now? Will you consider a trade again, or do you feel like your future is settled at the kennel?
No, I feel like my future is settled. I haven't thought about it, to be honest, at the moment. I'm just... The first few games, I just wanted to play well for the team, and that's what I do. And at the moment, I'm out injured, so that's what my focus is, and I haven't even thought about anything later on in the year.
So Josh Dunkley, best mates with Adam Treloar. Essendon right into him. He's obviously close with Adrian Dodoro. The Bombers love him, and so why wouldn't you? He's such a barometer, I think, around the stoppages for the Bulldogs. He's so important. So the fact that he's come out and said that he wants to stay at the Bulldogs is a fairly strong statement. That audio on Triple M over the weekend. Some other contract stock watch. Patrick Cripps, 15 touches yesterday, out of contract at the end of the year, one of the highest profile free agents. There was talk that he'd command around $1 million. Carlton have a tough decision to make now. Do you sort of pay him close to that and back him in? or do you accept that perhaps he's a little bit more one-paced than we thought, and you exercise a degree of caution there? And if you go and offer him 750 or 8 and just be a bit cautious from Carlton's point of view, you risk him going back to West Coast or Fremantle. It's pretty obvious.
Yeah, I'd have thought so. I hope he stays.
The Bont,
the Bont
on
was the next
fire,
one. Yep.
basically won the game out of the midfield yesterday. You'd have to think that a deal would be formalised with the Bulldogs in coming months. He's their captain. I think you'll want a 6 or 7 year deal. Maybe the Bulldogs are a bit cautious on that. They want more 5 or 6.
Well, I've heard that they're a year apart or something. I'm not sure.
I think that's right.
But you just do whatever you can to keep the Bont, I'd have thought. Captain,
Well,
best
Ahmed
player,
Baines, who's a Cluey CEO, might be a bit cautious on these long-term contracts, but if the market demands it, the market demands it, and there'd be a lot of clubs searching around the Bont. One thing I noticed about the Bont when I do the boundary riding is his pace. I know he's not recognised much for his pace, but his closing speed and his stride. He's just such a brilliant athlete. I love
pretty
watching
complete,
him.
isn't he?
And Jordan De Goey, he was in the doghouse last week, wasn't he? Because apparently he wasn't a very good midfielder and he wasn't fit enough and all the rest of it.
Yeah.
Lee Matthews said he belongs up forward. Lee Matthews, again, not surprisingly, was right. Geordie just kicked, I think it was 6 goals up forward.
6-3, I think, yeah.
Yeah, well, if he does that every week, he'll get his 750 or 800,000 and he'll be happy as Larry.
Indeed. And before we sign off for the day, Tommy, just some MRO news.
Yeah, Selwood was okay with that hit from Friday night. Lycett has to go directly to the tribunal. That dangerous tackle. I don't have a problem with that. I don't like seeing those sort of 2-action or 3-action sling tackles. Finlayson copped a week for that elbow on merit. That's a test case again for the tribunal because if the Giants appeal it like Fritsch did, might get off.
Ooh, you reckon they'd appeal that?
Well, it worked last week. I think the tribunal's out of step with the AFL rules on this stuff.
Yeah, fair enough. I'd be surprised. I feel like it's fairly different to the Fritsch one. If I were the Giants, I'd be taking the week and running personally. But
Go take the money and run.
Yes, indeed. But I think that will wrap us up for today, Tommy. Thanks for that. We'll be back Wednesday, I reckon.
Thanks, Rudy. Can't wait.
Yes, indeed. See you then.